class of Professor Matthieu Burnay. I sent an email to Matthieu this morning, maybe earlier this morning, to suggest that we will not have a break because this is an online lecture and we would use all the time. We can leave, we can conclude the class 15 minutes earlier. That will be Beijing time 4:40, and your time, Belgium, you said Brussels time, right? Brussels
Yes,
time
so
would be 9:40, will be 9:40, right?
Yes,
So
even 10:40, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So is that acceptable to you? So that this lecture would be from now to, so we'll be lasting for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Is that okay with you?
That's perfect, Professor Yang. That's perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess that we will be having a two session of discussion. First session, we'll be listening to your lecture, your introduction to the CAI. And the second section, without break, we will be having questions and answers, not necessarily based on the questionnaire I collected for you from all my class before 2 days ago. So so in the second section, just feel free to take up any questions that you have not touched upon in your first part of your introduction. And then I guess my class and the audience online would be raising follow-up questions, have interaction with you so that we could have a much better and more comprehensive understanding of the CAI, since this is a CAI is a really important agreement, and the future is not without any doubt. So with that, I would like to welcome Professor Burnay. So the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Professor Yang, for your very kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be here this morning or this afternoon with all of you. And I'm really grateful to you, Professor Yang, but also to Professor Cui for having extended this invitation to me. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, I mean, I was a student in Beida, I mean, more than 13 years ago, and I cherished the time when I was crossing, I mean, Tsinghua, beautiful campus on a daily basis when I was cycling from Udauko to Beida campus. That's one of the reasons why I'm delighted to be here. But the second reason is also because I really believe that it's more important than ever, I mean, to have such academic dialogues between Europe and China these days, which are very turbulent times in the bilateral relationship. So I think it's we are there, I mean, as academics, as students, as scholars, I mean, to create bridges. And I think that this is very much the idea of this project, which I'm working on together with Professor Cui, which is the Jean Monnet Network on EU-China Legal and Judicial Cooperation, which is a network of universities bringing together 3 Chinese universities, Tsinghua, Beisheda, and City University of Hong Kong, together with a number of European universities, including my own institution, a network which very much aims indeed to create bridges by improving the mutual understanding between China and Europe of each other's legal and judicial systems. So this is very much, I think, what we are talking about here, creating bridges. And in that sense, I mean, discussing the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment is, I think, an important discussion to have, not least in view of the very nature of the CAI as a watershed moment in international investment law, but also not least in view of the very turbulent recent months which we have known in the bilateral relationship between the EU and China, and with the potential impacts indeed that these crises might have on the upcoming ratification process of the CAI. I mean, a topic on which I will be delighted to come back during my presentation. So let me share my slides, and hopefully this should work. Do you confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Excellent. So the title of my presentation is EU-China CAI, the CAI between the EU and the People's Republic of China, State of Play and Way Forward. In this presentation, I would like, first of all, to talk a little bit about the background. And I think that it is important, not least in view of trying to understand the nature and content of the CAI, but also indeed to try to understand also as a way to understand the difficulties which we are currently facing on the way towards, the ratification of this bilateral investment treaty. So in this part dealing with the background, I would like first of all to explain why the European Union has the power to legislate in the area of investment law, and why indeed it was the European Commission which could negotiate the CAI on behalf of the 27 EU member states, 27, knowing that the United Kingdom has now formally left the European Union. What I would also like to say here are just a few words about the fact that whilst indeed the EU is trying to indeed establish what its practice in the area of international investment law will be, it is also quite interesting to see that a number of initiatives have been taken in China in recent years, also as a way to formalize and to further establish what foreign investment law actually means in the Chinese context. The last part in the background here, I just would like to look a little bit at statistics and just show you some graphs, also as a way to understand what we are actually talking about when we talk about the investment relationship between the EU and China. What I will do here is that I will primarily talk about the European perspective. So I will primarily be talking about China's outward foreign direct investments and not that much China's inward foreign direct investments, but I would be happy to come back to inward foreign direct investments during the discussion. In the second part, I would like us to look at some specific aspects of the CAI. I've had to pick and choose, some aspects which I think are particularly relevant, but again, here, I've been quite selective, and I would be happy to come back to other issues in the Q&A. I would like to say a few words about market access, which was really one of the priority areas for the European Union. The question of investor-state dispute resolution, and I think that Professor Young has indeed circulated the agreement to all of you, hence the excellent questions which Professor Young's students have sent to him, and to which I will be happy to come back during the Q&A. But all the students who read the agreement know indeed that there is no ISDS, provision included in the CAI, which was, to be honest, quite a surprise, at least on the European side, knowing how much the European Union put an emphasis on the need to include not a traditional ISDS provision, but rather, a provision that would establish something like the investment court system that the EU was able to negotiate, for instance, with Canada in the context of the CETA. Then another aspect which I would like us to look at is this idea of the CAI being recalibrated to include non-investor related protection mechanisms. We are here talking about the protection of the right of states to regulate. And here I would like to say a few words about the human rights, labor rights, and environmental protection provisions, which have been included in the CAI. And last but not least, and you may think that's a little bit weird to talk about that, but I really believe that we cannot these days talk about bilateral or multilateral instruments governing international investment law without having regard to unilateral instruments. What I'm referring here is the centrality of investment screening mechanisms on both the European side and the Chinese side, but also the increased focus which is put on corporate due diligence and corporate accountability, with the European Union trying to come up with a legally binding instrument at EU level, which would kind of use the template of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, And as a matter of fact, I mean, all those unilateral instruments might indeed be a challenge against the further liberalization of investments, which is indeed the very idea behind an agreement such as the CAI. And last but not least, I would obviously also like us to look at the way forward. And when I say the way forward, I mean indeed primarily the challenges on the way towards the ratification of the agreement. So this is, so to speak, the menu for this lecture. If you see that there is something I say which you do not understand, which is not clear, I literally have no issue having you interrupt me, being Professor Tsui, Professor Young, or anyone
Matthieu.
from the audience. Please really don't hesitate to interrupt me. It will be my
Matthieu.
pleasure also to
Matthieu?
answer any questions you may have during my presentation.
Okay.
So, first
Professor
one,
Burnay?
if we want to understand
Hello.
why it was indeed the
Come here.
European Commission which got to negotiate this agreement with the People's Republic of China, it is first of all very important to recognize the importance, the centrality of economic integration, of the idea of a market, of a single market, being at the heart of the process of European integration. Damrow, in that sense, talked about the idea of market power Europe. So this idea that the very identity of the European Union historically, so when we look back at the early stages of the European integration process after the Second World War and as of the 1950s, but also presently, are crucially linked to the experience of the European Union as a market. And this is very much in that context that one should situate, I mean, some of the key articles of the founding treaties of the European Union. And here I would like to refer to two articles which are very important in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. Article 3, which makes it clear that the European Union has an exclusive competence, meaning that the EU has been granted a power to legislate in an area which is called the Common Commercial Policy. The Common Commercial Policy, whose content is defined by another article of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which is Article 207, which makes it clear that the European Union has the power to legislate in the area of foreign direct investments. And I just would like to emphasize here that this is an additional power which was granted by the EU member states to the European Union quite recently, actually, that is back in 2007, 2008, when the European Union adopted the latest major revision of its founding treaties, which is the so-called Lisbon reform of the Treaty on the European Union and the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. So it is since 2008 that the EU member states no longer have the possibility to legislate in the area of foreign direct investment, a power or competence, to use the jargon of the European Union, which has now been transferred to the European Union. And quite importantly, this competence over foreign direct investment also has an external dimension, in the sense that if you look at paragraph 2 of Article 3 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, it states that the European Union also has the power to conclude international agreements in all those areas which fall under the umbrella of the Common Commercial Policy. Meaning that whenever these days the European Union wants to negotiate a bilateral, whenever an external partner such as China wants to negotiate an investment agreement with the European Union and its member states, China can no longer negotiate at bilateral level with each and every EU member state, but those negotiations have to take place with the European Union as a whole, and in that sense, it is the European Commission which is responsible for such negotiations. As a matter of fact, I mean, the very fact that the European Union only gained a competence over foreign direct investments recently means that we are only at the early stages. We are only at the early years of the EU affirming what the European Union perspective over foreign direct investments is. And also, we do not have many templates, if you like, of what international investment agreements negotiated by the European Union look like. And it is very interesting in that regard to look at the CAI, in the sense that the CAI is the first standalone investment agreement which has been negotiated by the EU. I mean, those of you who are interested in the area of international trade and international investment law will probably know indeed that the EU has negotiated a number of free trade agreements that include also an investment chapter. That is the case of CETA, the comprehensive agreement which was negotiated between the EU and Canada. So there we were talking about an FTA with an investment chapter. But here with the CAI, indeed, we are talking about the first ever standalone investment agreement which has been negotiated by the EU on behalf of all EU member states. We are there at the early stages, and the only thing which I would like to mention here is that the Chinese perspective on foreign direct investments and on international investment law has also very much evolved, I mean, in recent years. And here, I mean, you all know that, right? I mean, inward foreign direct investments have been indeed key, crucial in the process of opening up and reforms. When China started its Go Global strategy back in 1999, I mean, there was also the idea of China expanding its economic power by investing abroad. So China also becoming that way an important outward foreign direct investment and foreign direct investment actor. And indeed, I mean, against the background of the specific nature of the Chinese economy, which has been described as a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics, or indeed a model of statist model of market capitalism, the very negotiation of international investment agreements, of BITs, has indeed been an important tool which has been used by the People's Republic of China as a way indeed to increase, I mean, the amount of inward foreign direct investments, but also indeed to facilitate the establishment of outward foreign direct investments. And China has also been increasingly active at a variety of levels, being UNCITRAL, but also in the context of the G20, that China has increasingly tried to transform into an international investment framework and investment facilitation mechanism, ever since, in particular, China had the presidency of the G20 a few years ago. Obviously, we also had the adoption of China's own foreign investment law, which came into effect back in 2020. I mean, a foreign investment law which aims to consolidate, I mean, China's foreign investment regime, and which is as much part of, which is as much to be situated against the background of China's own domestic reforms, as it is also, I mean, to be situated as a way to reassure, if you like, foreign direct investors that their investments will be protected and will be promoted in China. So in that sense, and you all know that, having taken indeed Professor Yang's class, I mean, the very fact that, I mean, the foreign investment law, I mean, very much challenges or goes against what was until very recently the structural divide between foreign invested enterprises and Chinese companies, but also indeed that the foreign investment law provides a number of guarantees and a number of additional protection, which are indeed aimed to encourage, I mean, foreign investors to invest in the economy of the People's Republic of China. So again, there we do see a kind of parallel trend, if you like, with both the EU and China trying to consolidate, if you like, their own regime when foreign investment law, when international investment law are concerned. Now, let me say a few words about the background. And for that, I mean, I think it's kind of useful to show you a couple of graphs which have been published by the German think tank Merix, which do indeed look at recent trends in China's outward FDIs. And I just think that it's kind of useful to show those graphs to also emphasize what is very much the perception in Europe of the changing trends in China's international investment strategy. And I know that we lawyers, I mean, do sometimes tend to stick very much to an analysis of legal texts, but when the KAI is concerned, but whenever I think the legal relationship between the EU and China is concerned, it is very much important also to understand the political context, but also the economic context in which, I mean, those negotiations have been taking place. Sorry. So the first graph, which I would like to show you, is indeed the evolution of China's global outward FDI. I mean, as you can see here, I mean, there was a kind of tipping point back in 2016, with then a significant decline, which has characterized China's global outward FDIs. You can see a number of reasons behind this sharp decline as of 2017. I mean, we've seen, I mean, a very strong reinforcement of capital controls by the PRC as a way to address the risk of private companies suffering heavy losses on overseas investments. So as of 2017, we've seen a very significant rise, significant reinforcement of capital controls in the PRC, but we have also seen a kind of reorientation in the content of those outward foreign direct investment, with indeed, I mean, China's trying to invest increasingly in strategic sectors such as IT, robotics, or agriculture. I mean, and in that sense, I mean, investments which have met an increasing level of resistance, because indeed we are talking about elements which are considered as strategic assets. And we've seen a growing resistance in the sense that we can talk about an interest of China in what are considered, at least in Europe, but also in a number of other parts of the world, as strategic sectors of the national economies. Just to say that this kind of global trend in the sense of decrease as of 2017 has also characterized China's investment in Europe. So again, on this graph here, you can see that Chinese investments in Europe reached a kind of tipping point back in 2016, with then indeed a significant decrease as of 2017. And this trend has very much continued in 2018 and 2019. Now, you may wonder, and this is a point which is, I think, very important, that is, obviously here we are talking about the KAI, we are talking obviously about the relationship between the European Union and its 27 member states altogether and China. But we should also very much not underestimate, I mean, the fact that when we talk about the relationship between the EU and China, we are talking about a relationship that takes place at a multiplicity of levels. So here we'll be primarily talking today about the relationship between China and the European Union as a whole, because as I emphasized it is now the European Union which has the power to negotiate international investment agreements such as the KAI, and it was therefore the Commission which negotiated the agreement with the People's Republic of China. But we should also not underestimate the fact that the relationship with China also takes place at the level of EU member states. And in that sense, I do find this graph quite interesting, in the sense that on this graph, you do see, I mean, who are the main beneficiaries of China's investments in Europe and in the European Union. And here, as you can see on this graph, I mean, the main recipients of Chinese investments do remain, I mean, the so-called big three. I mean, on this graph, I mean, the UK is still included as a member state of the European Union. But just to say that China indeed keeps investing as a kind of priority in, if you like, the largest, but also among the strongest economies of Europe and of the European Union, namely France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, kind of confirming that one of the key priorities of those Chinese investments is obviously to have a positive economic return upon the investment that has been made. That being said, I mean, I think it's quite important not to underestimate the fact that the very politicization of Chinese investments in Europe, I mean, politicization of Chinese investments in Europe, which is a point to which I would like to come back in a few moments, is primarily due to the fact that we've also seen, I mean, a rise in Chinese investments in a number of EU member states, primarily located in Southern Europe, like Greece, but also Central and Eastern European countries, such as Hungary and Poland. And as a matter of fact, I mean, those states have kind of played a kind of double game, if you like, with the European Union, and prioritized, if you like, their bilateral relationship with China over what is the overall relationship between the EU and China. Hence the kind of sensitivity, if you like, of those Chinese investments taking place in those particular areas of the European Union, which are Southern and Central and Eastern Europe, with states such as Greece, like Costco's investment in the port of Piraeus in Greece, or if you like, to think about Hungary, I mean, the investment in the construction of a highway connecting the city of Belgrade with the Hungarian capital of Budapest. The next slide, the next graph, which I would like to show you here, and I hope that you can all read it. My apologies if it's not that clear on your screen. Very much relates to the debate around market access. I mean, what you can see here on this graph is the so-called FDI Regulatory Restrictiveness Index, which is prepared by the OECD. I mean, this index aims to assess the extent to which, I mean, an economy is open to foreign direct investments. The closer you get to zero, the more open your economy is. The closer you get to one, the higher the level of restriction, the higher the barriers towards foreign direct investments will be. And as you know, I mean, an economy has a variety of tools indeed to resist or to block the possibility for foreign direct investments, for inward foreign direct investments to take place. You can think of, obviously, investment screening mechanisms. You can think of the prohibition to incorporate wholly owned foreign companies. You can think of administrative procedures which are used indeed to restrict foreign direct investments. So there are obviously a variety of instruments, a very comprehensive toolbox which can be used by states to go against or to block indeed the possibility for foreign direct investments to be completely liberalized. And I just would like you to look at this graph and for us to navigate from the left to the right. According to this index, I mean, prepared by the OECD, very open, I mean, economies to foreign direct investments include Luxembourg, the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, Finland, Estonia, Spain, Latvia, Hungary, Greece, Belgium. You see me coming. Number of EU member states do appear, at least with regard to this FDI Regulatory Restrictiveness Index, as being very open towards FDIs, towards foreign direct investments. We have to wait quite a long time to reach China, which is, I think, after China, you still see, I mean, Russia and India, indeed. Just to say that according to this OECD FDI Regulatory Restrictiveness Index, I mean, a majority of EU member states do tend to be, by definition, quite open towards FDIs, whilst indeed, I mean, the Chinese economy still remains quite significantly, I wouldn't say closed, but at least you still have a number of mechanisms which exist and which indeed aim to restrict the possibility for foreign direct investments to take place in a variety of sectors of the Chinese economy, which actually answers one of the questions which was raised by a number of Professor Young's students. That is the fact that who gained the most with the CAI. I mean, I would say that in terms of market access, that as a matter of fact, I mean, EU member states were already quite open towards Chinese FDIs prior to the adoption of the CAI, whilst indeed, I mean, the Chinese economy, or at least a number of sectors of the Chinese economy, still imposed a number of restrictions towards foreign direct investments, including foreign direct investments coming from Europe. Now, if we think about the background, I mean, just want to say a few words about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is indeed an initiative which is all about Chinese investments in particular in the area of infrastructure. Obviously, this is an important aspect of the background of the CAI in the sense that Europe and the European Union is on the map, that the very existence of the Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, meant this idea of a growing trade and level of investments between the EU and China. Quite interestingly, I mean, this idea of enhancing connectivity, enhancing interdependence, which are, if you like, the key buzzwords behind the Belt and Road Initiative, are also important buzzwords in the jargon of the European Union. So if you like, there we very much see a kind of complementarity between the Belt and Road Initiative and a number of policy decisions which have been made at the level of the European Union. And in that sense, the European Union has very much tried, if you like, to respond to the Belt and Road Initiative, with the European Union proposing its own plans, in particular, to improve the connectivity and to renovate, I mean, the existing infrastructure linking the European Union with its direct neighborhood, being its direct neighborhood in the east, but also its direct neighborhood in the south. The reason why, I mean, I wanted to say a few words about the Belt and Road Initiative is because, I mean, the very debates around the Belt and Road Initiative and in the European Union do testify about the sensitivity of the very issue of Chinese investments in Europe. So I think it was 3 years ago. I mean, you had a headline in the weekly newspaper, The Economist, I mean, which used as a title, "Is China buying up Europe?" ? I mean, you had a number of newspapers in Europe using such headlines, I mean, kind of testifying to the sensitivity of the issue of Chinese investments in Europe. Why are those investments perceived as being sensitive? I mean, there is this idea of this idea that the Belt and Road Initiative would also imply some geo-economic or some geopolitical objectives from the perspective of the PRC. There is, I mean, the question of the politicization of Chinese investments in Europe, namely the fact that a number of member states of the European Union, but also a number of political parties in Europe have identified indeed this very issue of Chinese investments in Europe as being very sensitive for, let's say, two major reasons. The first one being that after, I mean, after the economic crisis of 2008, I mean, a number of EU member states were in a very difficult economic situation, and a number of EU member states, I mean, have been knocking at the door of indeed China to further invest in their national economy, which kind of triggered the fear of a rising dependence of those EU member states vis-a-vis China. So this is one issue. And then a second issue, which has been quite important, that is this very question of whether the EU as a whole and its member states should compartmentalize their relationship with China. Namely, I mean, in a context where indeed EU member states and the EU on the one side and China on the other side do have very different political systems, very different political cultures, which kind of raised, I mean, concerns in a number of EU member states that Europe should not enter into a process of business as usual with China against the background of difficult relationships in the area of human rights, in the area of the different values which the European Union is supposed to promote across all its foreign policies, which is a point to which I would like to come back when I will talk about indeed the right of states to regulate as being protected by the CAI. Another kind of issue which explains this high level of politicization relates to what I've already mentioned, namely this idea of the relationship between the EU and China taking place at a multiplicity of levels. And here I just would like to refer to the so-called 17+1 framework. 17+1 framework, which is a forum bringing together China with 17 states of Europe, in particular states which are located in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Southern Europe, which has been yet another parallel framework in which the bilateral relationship between China and Europe has taken place. The 17+1 framework is a framework in which investment relationships were discussed. This framework has not been very successful. I would be happy to come back in that regard, to that point, in the sense that lots of money, lots of investments have been promised, but in practice, very few of those investments have actually taken place in practice. But the very existence of those parallel frameworks, if you like, have been considered as being problematic from the viewpoint of the European Union. So this is what I wanted to tell you as part, let's say, of this context against which the CAI was negotiated. Let me now kind of dig into the agreement. So first of all, I mean, the very existence of the CAI is to be situated against the background of difficulties of the impossibility these days to negotiate, I mean, a multilateral treaty in the area of international investment law. So in that sense, both the PRC and the EU have indeed put in place, I mean, a massive program of negotiations of international investment agreements as a kind of way to fill in the existing gap which exists at the international level. And in that sense, the CAI is very much to be situated against the background of states, of important economic actors, negotiating those BITs, not only as a way indeed to promote foreign direct investments, but also as a way, and this is something to which I will come back, as a way to rebalance, if you like, the relationship between foreign direct investors and the host state. That is indeed this idea of international investment agreements that should no longer be about investment protection only, but that should also increasingly protect the right of states to regulate. If we want to think about the CAI and the background against which, again, the agreement as such was negotiated, it is important to understand the fact that the CAI is aimed to replace 25 bilateral investment treaties that are already in force, 25 bilateral investment treaties linking 26 EU member states, I will explain why in a moment, and the People's Republic of China. Why 26? Because Belgium and Luxembourg have a kind of joint BIT with the People's Republic of China. So in that sense, you have 25 BITs linking 26 EU member states with the PRC, or to put it in other words, all EU member states apart from Ireland did have, did have a bilateral investment treaty in force at the time when the EU got the power to legislate in the area of international investment law. So I have to go back here a little bit. So until the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty, the power to negotiate bilateral investment treaty was not situated at the level of the European Union, but did fall under the competence of EU member states. And that's why each and every EU member state was able to negotiate a bilateral investment treaty with the PRC. But ever since the European Union gained the competence over foreign direct investments, it has been the European Commission and the European Union as a whole, which has had indeed this competence to negotiate with foreign actors, including the PRC. So in that sense, when you think about the CAI is aimed to replace, those 25 existing BITs, which are still these days in force. The negotiations of the CAI were launched in February 2012, so quite some time ago when you think about it. And to be very honest with you, most of the analysts or experts, following the negotiations were not very optimistic. We're not very optimistic, in particular in view of what had been identified by the European Commission, at least, as the kind of deadline for the negotiations to be concluded. Back in 2019, the new president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, stated that one of her key objectives as the new president of the European Commission was to step up negotiations with China with the aim of reaching an agreement by the end of 2020. If you had asked me in November whether an agreement was to be concluded with China by the end of 2020, my answer would have been, and was actually, no way. The EU and China will never be able to reach that target of reaching an agreement by the end of 2020. And still, we all received this kind of nice Christmas present, at the end of 2020, with this important announcement made by the EU and China, that the EU and China had been able to conclude an agreement in principle on the comprehensive agreement on investments. I think there are a number of elements which are to be mentioned if we want to understand what has been the acceleration in the bilateral negotiations between the EU and China at the end of 2020. The first one, and I think that this has been a kind of crucial point, it is clearly the power transition in the United States. Power transition in the United States, with the perception on the Chinese side, at least, that the Biden administration was indeed likely to come up with, let's say, a more, what is the nice word to use here, a more predictable or a more stable or usual type of foreign policy, not only vis-à-vis China, but also vis-à-vis Europe. And in that sense, that it was very much in that sense, in the interest of China to make some last minute concessions as a way to get, if you like, this agreement, to get this agreement concluded, bearing in mind that the symbolic nature of the conclusion in principle of that agreement, at least on the Chinese side, was a very important point. From the European perspective, also, it would probably have been way more difficult to conclude an agreement in principle with the PRC after the power transition in the United States, in a context where, as you all know, the relationship between the Trump administration and the European Union was very much turbulent, and that indeed the relationship between the EU and the US is very much likely to be normalized under the presidency of Joe Biden. Another, kind of element which is to be mentioned, if you want to understand this acceleration at the end of 2020, I think, is the ratification of RCEP, of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. China kind of pushed, the ratification of RCEP, and in that sense, adding the CAI was yet another instrument, being a bilateral instrument, to be added to this portfolio of major instruments which had been recently ratified by the People's Republic of China. And last but not least, yet another important factor, but that's for the EU side. It was the end of the German presidency of the European Council back in December 2020. So there is a system of rotating presidency of the European Council, which is another institution at the heart of the European Union. So every few months, you have a different EU member state that takes the presidency of the European Union. And as a matter of fact, the conclusion of the CAI was very much a priority for the German government, which is to be understood against the background of the fact that Germany is very much is a very important actor in the area of foreign investment in China. Germany has big interests in terms of having access to the Chinese market, and in that sense, the German presidency really identified as one of its key objectives the conclusion of the CAI. So these are the different, let's say, elements which I would mention as a reason behind, the speeding up of the negotiations of the CAI at the end of 2020. You've all seen, the agreement, different sections. Here I will primarily talk about section 2 on investment liberalization, so the very question of market access. I will also say a few words about chapter 4, which is about sustainable development. I will talk here about environmental protection and the protection of labor rights. But I would also like to say a few words about dispute settlement, that is section 5. On market access, the agreement was, let's say, did necessitate to receive the specific schedules, of liberalization on both the EU side and the Chinese side. Those schedules have now been released, and in that sense give you more information as to the details of market access provisions and the market access aspects of the CAI. So let me first of all say a few words about the question of market access. It is very clear that the question of market access was a very important one from the perspective of the European Union. The CAI as such, enabled, a greater market opening in China, at least with regard the current level of liberalization of the Chinese economy. So in that sense, the European Union has been able, if you like, thanks to the CAI, to reach a level of market liberalization or of investment liberalization in China in the context of the bilateral investment relationship that matches, if you like, the overall level of liberalization of the Chinese economy. Two sectors which were of particular importance from the perspective of the European Union were, obviously, in the area of manufacturing, the whole area of car production, in which the EU has been able to secure, a greater market access, but also in the service sector, and in particular financial services, have been considered as a major improvement following indeed the conclusion principle of the CAI. I do see there is a hand raised. Sorry, there is a hand raised.
Hello, thank you very much, Matthieu.
To intervene?
Yeah, I have two questions. before you move on to the market access to the.
I cannot
text
hear
of
you,
the-
Professor Young.
Can you hear me right now? No, can you hear me right now? Hello?
The sound doesn't work at my end.
Can you hear me right now? No?
I cannot
Right now?
I cannot hear you.
No?
Shall I
One moment.
continue or
No, just a minute. Hmm?
really sorry, is it an issue at my end?
Just one.
Just a minute. Okay, yeah.
他看了啊？他为什么听不到呢？不知道。
I cannot hear Professor Young. Am I the only one who cannot hear him?
So when you can you unplug your headset?
Maybe
Could you
Professor Tsui or anyone else can intervene, because I think I cannot hear Professor Young. Oh, you can hear Professor Young. So the problem is at my end then. My apologies for that.
孙昭孙昭可以听到。
Try
那
something.
个国民
Oh,
能
sorry. The problem is at my end. Really sorry for that.
他这有可能 OK。
Now I can hear you. My
Great,
apologies,
great. Thank
Professor
you.
Young. Really sorry for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for excellent introduction on the background of this CAI. And I have two questions before you move on to the text or market access part of the of your introduction. Two questions. Number one is about the relationship of the CAI or CAI with the other what do you call the BITs, right? You mentioned there are 25 BITs, but the island with China already, and what is the relationship between these 25 BITs and the CAI? I guess that Article 15 of the subsection, section 6, almost the end of the CAI, that is Article 15, said the relationship between 15 said the relation with other agreements, previous agreements between members states of the EU, European Union, or the blah blah, and EU and China are not superseded or terminated by this agreement. So could you please elaborate a little bit on this once again? I know you mentioned that already for the 25 BITs and all the member states of the EU and also but the island. So this is number one question. Now question number two is related to the Trump administration. What you said is the power transition in the US, right? You used the word power transition in the US at the end or the beginning of this year or end of that last year. So you talked about that. This is a very important factor for the acceleration of the CAI negotiation, so that by the end of the last year, 2020, we could, you and China could conclude the negotiations. Could you elaborate once again a little bit clearer on the relationship between the power transition in the US and the negotiation between EU and China on the CAI? I know you said a little bit on that, and so I think we need a little bit further clarification on the relationship between these two factors. So could you please elaborate a little bit? Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Young, for those two questions. The first one is indeed, as you mentioned it, the CAI, I mean, does foresee the fact that the CAI shall not supersede, I mean, existing BITs between the European Union, the EU member states, and China. What are the implications in practice of all that? To be very honest, there are still many unknowns. I just would like to mention two facts. The first one is that those existing BITs between EU member states and China were what you could call, by EU standards, old generation BITs. Old generation BITs being BITs which were, first of all, very short, not comprehensive, not dealing that much with non-investment related issues, such as environmental protection, labor rights, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I mean, we are talking, so the CAI, I mean, does add many elements by its very comprehensive nature to what are still the content, indeed, of those existing BITs between EU member states and China, with a number of them, I mean, which were concluded in the 1980s, early 1990s. So for those of you who study, indeed, China's treaty practice in the area of international investment law, you all know, I mean, how those treaties at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s looked like. And indeed, I mean, those BITs between EU member states and China were not very different in that regard. That being said, I would say that one area in which the existing BITs between EU member states and China will still remain very important is the area of dispute resolution, which is a point to which I will come back when I will talk about ISDS, or the absence of ISDS in the CAI. That is the very fact that China and the EU were not able to include an investor protection mechanism in the CAI in the form of ISDS or in the form of ICS, actually means that the EU member states and China will still be able to rely upon the dispute resolution mechanisms which exist in the context of the bilateral investment treaties linking individual EU member states with China, which is a point to which I would like to come back, because when we compare those 25 existing BITs, we can see that when dispute resolution is concerned, that the existing framework is very much fragmented, and that the dispute resolution mechanisms included in those 25 BITs do vary extensively when you compare them with each other, for the very simple reason, again, that some of those BITs were indeed negotiated in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when indeed China was not really ready to include, let's say, traditional ISDS provisions as part of those agreements. So just to say that I think that the main relevance of those BITs between EU member states and China post-CAI, if the CAI was to be ratified, would probably be in the area of dispute resolution, and would probably be at the level of dispute resolution. And also, I mean, let's not underestimate the fact that, again, if the CAI was not to be ratified, that we would still have those bilateral investment treaties between the EU member states and China. Okay, so let's be very clear. If the CAI was not to be ratified, EU member states and China would not be left with nothing. We would still have indeed those BITs between EU member states and China, but again, old generation BITs for most of them. With regard to the power transition, it has been, I think, indeed an important factor. From the perspective of the European Union, the relationship between the EU and the Trump administration was very turbulent, for the very least. I mean, the Trump administration was the first administration in quite a long time, which was by definition not supportive of the European integration process. To take one example, I mean, President Trump, I mean, was very much in favor of Brexit. I mean, Brexit, which was from the EU perspective, a massive blow against the process of European integration. And therefore, there was this expectation that the relationship between the EU and the United States would be easier under the Biden administration. And this is something which has already materialized in a number of ways, with the Biden administration rejoining, I mean, the Paris Agreement on climate change, with the Trump administration, with the Biden administration contributing in what is perceived in Europe in a more positive way in the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, NATO, and so on and so forth. So to put it in a gentle way, it was probably easier for the European Union to adopt an agreement that would not be popular in the United States under the Trump administration than it would have been to adopt such an agreement under the Biden administration, which is by definition more pro-EU than the Trump administration actually was. From the Chinese perspective, on the other side, I think that the whole debate is whether to be read against the fact that the Trump administration was very much against the very existence of those bilateral or multilateral agreements. The first thing that the Trump administration did when it came into power was to repeal those so-called bad deals, right? I mean, there was very much the idea of America first. Let's repeal all those bad deals we have signed and ratified with other countries, which do not allow us to prioritize the American people over, I mean, over foreigners. And in that sense, I mean, what we saw, I mean, in recent years under the Trump administration was indeed China developing very much a rhetoric in favor of multilateralism, in favor of international cooperation. This is against this background that one should read, I mean, China's central role in the negotiations and the very fast ratification of the RCEP. Oh, sorry. Hello? Is it okay? Okay, sorry. And so China was very much active in the negotiations of RCEP, was very fast to conclude it. And in that sense, China did portray itself a little bit as a kind of champion of bilateralism and multilateralism, at least to be more of a champion of bilateralism and multilateralism than the Trump administration itself. So in that sense, it was, I think, in the interest of China to conclude such an agreement before, I mean, the US foreign policy going back to a kind of normal, with the US no longer being that much of a troublemaker in the context of the WTO, with the US rejoining a number of bilateral and multilateral instruments that the Trump administration had left. So I don't know if, does that answer your two questions, Professor Young? I hope that
Thank you.
Some clarification.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Can you hear me right now?
I can hear you very well, yes.
You. I think I have a follow-up question on this so-called power transition in the US. So right now we have a Biden administration, and we see that, something foreign policy very different from what we were expecting at the end of last year, that is at the election. So what will be the implication for the new administration, I mean Biden administration, on the future? I know you will be talking about the future of the KAI, but right now, what will be the future for this KAI under the Biden administration? At this moment, we see some, even see some confrontations, we see some gray future, right? What's your perspective on this issue.
Thank you very much, Professor Young. It's a very difficult question, I think, because we are still very much in the early days of the Biden administration. That being said, I mean, I kind of agree with you that I don't know if you have the same assessment of the early days of the Biden administration in terms of the US-China policy. Or the China policy of the United States under the Biden administration. I think it was also very much of a surprise at my end. I just don't know whether it was for the same reason as the reasons you would yourself identify. But what I would say at my end is that we've seen a kind of continuity in the assertiveness of the US foreign policy vis-a-vis China under the Biden administration. I would just say that the language has changed. So we are no longer, analyzing the US-China policy when reading tweets on a daily basis. But let's say that we have now a more traditional US foreign policy vis-a-vis China, but still, I mean, one foreign policy which is very assertive, as best exemplified by the meeting which took place at high level in Alaska, I mean, a few weeks ago. What I would still say, and I think this is something which is quite interesting from the perspective of the discussions on the CAI, that is the fact that the Biden administration is apparently willing and ready to compartmentalize its relationship with the PRC. Namely, I mean, meeting up, being able to do different things at the same time. That is, on the one side, to be extremely critical against what are perceived in the United States as human rights violations being committed by China on the one side, and at the same time, I mean, pushing very much the idea of a joint summit to fight against climate change. So this idea of a kind of multiple speeds or different type of engagement that would be different depending on the issue areas. Namely, we can discuss certain things, let's say, as partners, but in other areas, we are definitely competitors or systemic rivals, to use the term used by the Biden administration. So now the question is, to what extent will the Biden administration a key factor in the way forward for the CAI? I don't see the United States being a decisive factor. Namely, I mean, in recent years, what we've seen are a number of instances where the United States has tried to pressure the European Union to align to the US-China foreign policy. I mean, one example is, for instance, at the time of the creation of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the AIIB, I mean, EU member states were put under huge pressure by the United States not to join the AIIB. Still, what do we have at the moment? We have, what is it, 20 EU member states which have joined the AIIB. So you may say, okay, the CAI is not the AIIB and the CAI is way more important than the AIIB, but still, I think the AIIB was a good example, if you like, of an instance where the US put EU member states under a huge pressure to align to the US-China foreign policy. And at the same time, we saw in Europe this idea of resisting to that with member states such as France, Germany, or the United Kingdom at the time, indeed joining as founding members of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. That being said, what we do, and it's kind of linked to the first part of my answer, what we do witness these days in Europe is a debate around the possibility to compartmentalize the relationship with the PRC. And I will come back to this whole tit-for-tat dynamic of sanctions between China and the EU, which is likely to have which has definitely a negative impact on the prospects of the ratification of the CAI. But what we do see in Europe these days is an increasingly significant debate on whether the EU should compartmentalize its relationship with China. That is the question of to what extent can we at the same time be very critical vis-a-vis China in the area of human rights, and at the same time conclude an agreement such as the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. This is what I mean by compartmentalization, separating issue areas and taking one or the other specific route in the engagement with the PRC. So this would actually be my answer to that question, Professor Young.
Thank you.
I don't know if it addressed your different points.
Thank you very much. Let me see whether my students in the class have questions, have follow-up questions to you. 我们有没有提问的? So I recognize that when you had your instruction at the very beginning, you mentioned, you touched upon one of the questions from our students. That is on the who benefit more from the KI. You talk about market access and some other issues. I guess this is one of the first questions I collected from our students. So I wanted to see whether he or she, Sun Yirong, has a further question on this who benefit, EU or China, who benefit more from the KI. Let me see whether Yirong has anything to clarify or any questions, further questions on this issue. No, okay. Okay.
I may be happy, Professor Yang, to compliment, because this was indeed a very relevant question, if I may, and if I may just answer it, let's say, in a more straightforward way. So the question was, is it fair to say that EU will benefit more from the KI? I would say that in terms of market access, I would say yes. I mean, one of the major goals of the EU negotiators was to, I quote, rebalance the economic relationship with China, which was perceived as being imbalanced in view of what was considered as the openness of the European markets towards Chinese investments on the one side, and I mean, the fact that there were still many restrictions on the Chinese side, in particular in some areas of the economy. That being said, and this is something very important to mention that in that regard, is the very fact that Chinese investments in Europe have become increasingly politicized in recent years has also led to a rise in protectionism in Europe vis-à-vis Chinese investments, and that is particularly true in the area of green energies, for instance. So I don't want to say that Europe is perfect. I don't want to say that all sectors of the European economy are open to Chinese investments, but there was still, when you look at numbers, this idea of rebalancing. From the Chinese perspective, I would say that the very conclusion of the KI was per se a very strong reassurance from Europe that Europe would remain open towards Chinese investments. And when you think about the context of the US-China trade war, when you think about the high politicization of Chinese investments, just the very fact that the EU was willing to conclude such an agreement in principle was per se a very positive news from the Chinese perspective, in the sense that there had been many rows in recent years around, let's say, 5G, I mean, Huawei's investments in Europe and stuff like that. So the very fact that the EU was actually ready and willing to adopt such an agreement was a positive news. And last but not least, there was very much from the Chinese perspective the idea of a symbolic victory. Namely, I mean, the possibility for China to negotiate a comprehensive investment agreement with its first economic partner, namely the European Union, against the background of the US-China trade war. And in that sense, the symbolic nature of the KI is, I think, very much not to be underestimated. So these would just be a few additions to that question, Professor Yang.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess I should have stopped here, but let me finish with one final question on this issue. I guess that the question on who benefit more basically come from the text of the KI, which is you see that always China commit to do something, and but it is right for EU to say that rules and principles already embedded in the EU law, which means that the EU does not need to do much to implement the KI. For China, there are a lot of obligations, right? So the feeling comes from the balance or imbalance of this text. But so when we talk about this kind of feeling, it reminds me of the US-China so-called phase one agreement, right? Right. In the agreement, you see everywhere there was only China's commitment, right? Somewhere there are some paragraphs, especially in the intellectual property rights section, which said that the United States has done that already, right? Somewhere, only a few paragraphs says that both sides need to do something, which means that also means that the United States has done everything, but it's up to China to do a lot of other things. So if we could conclude by very briefly compare the KII, the CAI, and the so-called phase one agreement between U.S. and China, to see the right and right feeling from this imbalance, or who benefit first. Matthieu, please.
I think it's a very good point, Professor Young, and let me probably answer your question in a kind of indirect way, if I may. Your comment very much reminds me of debates, and for very good reasons, I think, which were very prominent when China joined, the World Trade Organization back in 2001. As we all know, China's accession to the WTO was the fruit of a very long, difficult relationship, a difficult negotiation process between China and the WTO, between China and WTO members at the time. And China had to give up a lot. China had really to give up a lot in order to become a member of the WTO, by indeed having to abide to a very high number of WTO plus and WTO minus obligations. When looking back to, what China has had to do, if you like, to become a member of the WTO back in 2001, is, despite the very imbalance in China's accession protocol and the terms governing China's accession to the WTO, is that when we look back to this more than 15 years after that, it seems still to have been quite a successful story. Not least in view of the amazing economic growth which has characterized the development of China's economy since China joined the WTO back in 2001. So that would be the first part of my answer. The second part is indeed the very fact that this approach by the European Union is that you have described here, is very much a template that the European Union uses across, all the agreements it currently negotiates. And so whenever you talk about those non-investment related provisions, I think we will all agree that it would be far better if, those negotiations were to take place at the level of the WTO or any other multilateral organizations. Nevertheless, in practice, in view of the stalemate in the WTO context, unfortunately, those negotiations have indeed to take place at bilateral level. Now, in terms of the very posture, which is what to describe, namely this idea of the EU or the US saying, this is something which we have already done. And therefore we do not have that much to do in addition to what we have already done. I don't think that this is the right posture, if you like, because I think it gives again the kind of impression that China would have to take by definition the same path as the economic development path, a way which has been chosen by the European Union or by the United States. That being said, I would still say that, China has definitely become increasingly confident in its own model, and a kind of confidence that you can see, let's say since 2017, with indeed, the increasing political control, not only over SOEs, but also over private corporations. I mean, things which we had not seen that much in the years prior to 2017. And here my question would be, and there were indeed many questions by your students with regard SOEs, that is the extent to which the language used in the CAI, or the language used in agreements signed by the PRC these days, do indeed correspond to what is, let's say, I mean, the more general economic trends in China these days, in particular in terms of the relationship between the state and corporations. So there again, just to add yet another nuance, I also think that there is sometimes, if you like, a kind of mismatch between what is described, for instance, in the CAI, and what I would identify as the reality of the Chinese economy in 2021. So as you see, it's a kind of indirect answer to your question, but does it kind of address the key points which you wanted me to address, Professor Yang?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Yang. So shall I continue with the questions of market access and the different other points?
大家还有没有要提问？没有。Okay, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Yang, and please really don't hesitate to do that again. Again, it's really a pleasure for this session to be as interactive as possible. So I've mentioned a greater market opening in China. Still, we do see, I mean, some concessions which have been made by the European Union in some sectors of the European economy, which were still very much close to foreign investments and foreign investments from China. The sector of renewable energies is one of them. I mean, you do have some conditions Chinese investors will have to comply with, but still, it is, I think, one of the breakthrough, I mean, of the agreement. The very idea that the CAI aims to facilitate and encourage investment in environmental goods and services is also something which I think is quite interesting in the context of the CAI, but we do also see that, I mean, no concessions have been made by the EU in some sectors which were considered as being strategic, such as fossil and nuclear energies, which are very sensitive domains, nor water services. So we do see, I mean, indeed, a kind of opening in the area of some environmental goods and energy goods, but not all of them. Another point which I wanted to mention in terms of market access, and there was something which was very important from both the Chinese and the European perspective, there was this idea of maintaining but not reinforcing the existing investment screening mechanisms. So one of those unilateral measures, a unilateral economic instrument, economic law instrument, which can be used by both China and the European Union to restrict the access of foreign investors to domestic markets. So here, the CAI quite interestingly preserves, I mean, the level of the existing investment screening mechanisms as they existed before the conclusion in principle of the CAI. Now, let me move on to the second issue area which I wanted us to look at, which is the question of investor-state dispute settlement. I mean, for us to understand what is included and also what is not included in the CAI, it is, I think, important to have regard to some more general considerations first. I mean, first of all, the fact that traditionally, I mean, the main venue for investor-state dispute settlement has been for a number of decades now the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, so-called ICSID, with the system of traditional ISDS, which has been very much criticized for a number of years for a variety of reasons, including its lack of transparency, its lack of legitimacy, the lack of consistency in case law, and also the insufficient existence of review mechanisms, or indeed the difficulty to appeal, I mean, decisions being made in the context of traditional ISDS. And it is very much against this background of critiques, of criticisms made against traditional ISDS that one should situate not only, discussions taking place on ISDS reforms at the level of the United Nations, discussions at multilateral level in which not only the EU, but also China have been very active. But here, what I just would like to emphasize are two proposals for reforms, or let's say two alternatives to traditional ISDS, which have been proposed, which have been suggested by the European Union in recent years. And I think that those alternatives are to be mentioned if we want indeed to understand the negotiations of the dispute resolution mechanism provisions, which have been or which have not been included in the context of the CAI. So first of all, the European Union came up with the idea of an investment court system. An investment court system which has been included, for instance, in the comprehensive trade agreement that the EU has negotiated with Canada, but again, a trade agreement which included an investment chapter, with the idea of an investment court system that should be public, permanent, with professional judges and not private arbitrators, which should be appointed in advance. And this idea of judges appointed in advance is a very important one, because indeed, this is one of the major criticisms that China has vis-à-vis the investment court system. We are talking about a two-tier system, which consists of a first instance tribunal, but also an appellate tribunal. So this idea that decisions made in first instance shall be indeed, shall potentially be appealed if indeed any of the parties were not to be happy with the outcome of the case. Importantly, from the perspective of EU law, the very system of investment court system has been considered as compatible with EU law, which is a point to which I would like to come back when I will talk about indeed the reasons why, the EU did not want to include a traditional ISDS provision in the CAI and was rather in favor of the inclusion of a mechanism that would have been similar to the investment court system. Another proposal or another alternative which has been suggested by the European Union is the idea of a multilateral investment court, with indeed the European Commission having received a mandate by the European Union to negotiate indeed with other key economic partners the establishment of such a multilateral investment court, whose very objective would be to address the critiques made against ISDS mechanisms. Again, here we would be not talking about something like the ICS, which would be linked to one particular agreement, but we would be talking about a multilateral investment court that would be permanent, independent, consistent in case law, and indeed with a comprehensive appeal system. Now, this is very much the kind of perspective at EU level. On the Chinese side, and you all know that, China has adopted a cautious and has adopted a gradualist approach on ISDS. When you look at the first generation BITs, which were negotiated by China, including, and that's something important, obviously, for our discussion, with EU member states prior to the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty, they did not include effective enforcement mechanisms. The perspective has changed gradually. Since the late 1990s, a variety of explanations have been given to that, from the idea of a more liberal approach to protect Chinese companies overseas. Some have referred to a kind of spillover effects from China's accession to the WTO to the area of international investment law and investor protection mechanisms, or also the idea that China had first to test ISDS with smaller developing countries before indeed adopting BITs, including ISDS provisions provisions with bigger economies. That being said, and that's something important to bear in mind, that China's experience in ISDS is still very much limited. And here I always find it quite interesting to compare, China's experience with the WTO dispute settlement mechanism with indeed, what is also the same kind of learning experience of China in the area of international investment law. So when the CAI was negotiated, there was the question of what should be the model. What should be the type of investment dispute resolution mechanism to be included? Shall it include an ISDS provision? Will China agree on the establishment of an investment court system? And in general, is China kind of supportive of the idea of a multilateral investment court? In that sense, it is to put it in a blunt way. CAI does not include an investor protection mechanism in the form of an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, being either traditional ISDS or the investment court system. No consensus could be found. From the EU perspective, it was very clear that a traditional ISDS provision was a no-go, in the sense that the very existence of the investment court system mechanism is to be situated against the massive criticisms against traditional ISDS. And there is very much this understanding in the European Union that the European Union will never be able to have its member states ratify a BIT that would include a traditional ISDS provision. So from that perspective, there was very much this understanding from the EU standpoint that ICS is a progress, is positive in the sense that it addresses many of the shortcomings of traditional ISDS. And because of those very shortcomings, there was no way for the EU to go back to its member states and to say, we were not able to negotiate an ICS, so we had to go back to a more traditional type of ISDS provision. On the Chinese side, there are, let's say, there were a number of criticisms made against ICS. The first one of which being the fact that China is not really in favor of the establishment of a permanent standing two-tier mechanism, even if indeed, as you all know, China has proved to be increasingly supportive of the establishment of a permanent appeal mechanism. Secondly, the second difference, which I would mention, is the fact that China is very keen to retain the rights of parties to appoint arbitrators at the level of first instance. So in contrast with the EU, which very much wants to apply a system of full-time adjudicators which are appointed in advance, this is apparently something China is not very much in favor of. So there you do see, if you like, two differences or two different views from the EU perspective and from the Chinese perspective on ICS, with China indeed being primarily supportive of reform initiatives or reforms of traditional ISDS as they are being negotiated at the level of UNCITRAL, which is also an important point to bear in mind. So the question is, what are we left with in a context where we do not have a substantive investor protection mechanism included in the CAI? First of all, it is important to bear in mind that Article 3 of subsection 2, section 6 of the CAI, sorry, not the VI, but the CAI, obviously, that the two parties have agreed to continue the negotiations of an investment protection and investment dispute settlement. So there is a rendezvous clause, which is that those negotiations should, in theory, continue in the coming 2 years on the negotiations of such an investment protection, substantive investment protection mechanism. To be very honest, I mean, I don't see any great prospect for breakthrough at bilateral level. I mean, if progress is to be made, I rather think that it will be made at the level of UNCITRAL rather than at the level of the bilateral relationship between the EU and China. Another point which is to be mentioned, and this is something which we discussed with Professor Young at the beginning of the lecture, that is indeed the fact that previous agreements between the EU member states and China will continue to exist, and in particular, obviously, procedural provisions on dispute resolution that exist between EU member states and China will continue to exist. But as I mentioned it, we are talking there about a framework which is very much fragmented, if you like. I mean, out of the 25 existing BITs, you have, if I counted correctly, 13 BITs which provide ISDS provisions for any disputes which arise out of investments. For pre-1994 BITs, so let's say all the generation types of BITs, the scope of ISDS is very much limited to the amount of compensation for expropriation. So as you can see, we are talking there very much of old style, I mean, BITs. And in that sense, if CAE was not to be ratified, I mean, I would argue that what we are left with, namely bilateral investment treaties between EU member states and China, is not satisfactory. It's not satisfactory because indeed of the very fragmented nature of the existing investor protection mechanisms, but also, and this is the next point to which I wanted to come, because indeed of the fact that we are also talking there about BITs which are very much of the older generation and which do not include this idea of a balancing exercise between an international investment agreement that is aimed to further liberalize international investments, and at the same time, indeed, an international investment agreement which also aims, if you like, to protect the right of states to regulate. And this is this idea of recalibration, which I would like us to discuss now. So first of all, as you all know, I mean, international investment agreements no longer function as instruments serving business instruments only. There is this idea that international investment agreements should not only favor the quantity of invest, should not only have an impact on the quantity, but also on the quality of investments, with indeed direct links which have been made among many other international organizations by the G20 between international investment agreements and the promotion of sustainable development. This perspective has been very much endorsed by the European Union. So when indeed the EU gained the power to legislate in the area of foreign direct investments, different EU institutions, including the Commission and the European Parliament, made it clear that the EU approach towards bilateral investment treaties should also include elements which are not serving business interests only. Just to quote here the European Parliament resolution on the future of European international investment policy back in 2011, BITs negotiated by the EU should also be based on investor obligations in terms of compliance with human rights and anti-corruption standards as part of a broader partnership between the EU and developing countries for the purpose of reducing poverty. What I would like to emphasize here is that whilst, I mean, I've been referring here to, let's say, policy documents or documents which have no legally binding value, I just would like to emphasize the fact that according to the treaties founding the European Union, and in particular, Article 21 of the Treaty on the European Union, Article 21 of the Treaty on the European Union makes it clear that the EU's foreign policy shall be guided by a set of principles. So whatever the European Union does, and as an international actor, shall be guided, and here I'm talking because of the founding treaty of the European Union, shall be guided by a set of values which include the rule of law, human rights, and so on and so forth, all the principles which you do see listed here on this article. So if you like, the European Union is bound by the treaties to include or to take into consideration non-investment related concerns such as labor rights, environmental protection, human rights, whenever it negotiates either an international free trade agreement or an international investment agreement. Whether the EU applies double standards, yes, definitely it does. So I don't want to say that the EU is perfect. The only thing that I want to say is that the EU is bound by its founding treaties to take those values seriously in all areas of its own external action, including the EU's activeness in the area of global investment governance. Just a few words on yes,
Matthew.
Professor Yang, sorry.
Yeah, could I interrupt at this moment? Does that, could you turn back to your last slide?
Yes.
Yeah, does that, when you talk about 21, Article 21.1, does that illustrate the mentioning of United Nations Charter and also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the preamble of the CAI? Am I right to say that?
Yes, you're extremely right to say that, Professor Yang, and just to say that it's not something which is specific to the CAI, but if you look, for instance, at the bilateral trade agreement between Japan and the European Union, you also have a reference made to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the preamble of that agreement. So as you know, I mean, a preamble has no legal effect. But if you like, I mean, the very reference made to human rights in the preamble of that agreement was definitely, I mean, something which was important from the perspective of the European Union, not least in view of the existence of this Article 21. So as you've just mentioned, there is indeed a reference made to general human rights in the preamble, but there are also more specific references to labor rights in the core of the text, which is another point to which I would like to come back in a moment. But definitely, you can see a causal link between the two.
Matthew, we have a question from a student here.
Yes.
Hi, Mr. Burnay. I have a question. To my little knowledge about EU law, there's a competence division between EU and EU members, and we know that FDI belongs to the exclusive competence of the EU. However, the ISDS is not. I'm wondering, is that a reason for so the ISDS mechanism has not been written into the CAI?
That's an extremely good question, and thank you for raising it. It was something to which I wanted to come back when talking about the ratification, but I'm very happy to do it now. So what you are referring here to is the so-called saga, which occurred, I mean, at the time of the negotiations and ratification of the comprehensive trade agreement between the EU and Canada. At the time, there was, the agreement between the EU and Singapore, the free trade agreement between the EU and Singapore. At the time, there was the question of whether, indeed, the free trade agreement between the EU and Singapore was falling under the exclusive competence of the European Union, or was indeed also including elements falling under the shared competence of both the European Union and its member states. What does it mean in practice? It is that when you have a policy area which falls under the exclusive competence of the European Union, EU institutions only have to ratify that international agreement. Here, in the context of the CAI, indeed, it will only be the European Parliament with a simple majority and the Council of the EU with a qualified majority that will have to ratify the CAI. Now, if the CAI had been a so-called mixed agreement, then it would not only have been the Parliament and the Council of the EU, which would have been competent or which would have had the power to give their green light or their red line to the CAI, but also all national parliaments and sometimes subnational parliaments of EU member states which would have had a word to say. So if you take the EU-Singapore agreement, if you take the EU-Canada agreement, it was not only the European Parliament, but also the Council of the EU, the 27 EU national parliaments, plus a number of subnational parliaments which had to say yes to the agreement. If a single of those actors was to say no, the agreement could not be ratified. Okay, so why? Why was the CETA a mixed agreement, and why is the CAI not a mixed agreement? So why had CETA have to be ratified by all EU member states, national parliaments, subnational parliaments, and not the CAI? It is for the very reason you are referring here to. The very fact that an opinion was released by the Court of Justice of the EU on the EU-Singapore trade agreement, which stated that ISDS, and by the way, also portfolio investments, both portfolio investments and ISDS were falling under the shared competence of the EU and its member states. So you could argue, if you were to be a little bit ironic, that it was in the interest of the EU for this agreement and of China for this agreement not to be a mixed agreement, and for this agreement to fall under the exclusive competence of the EU, because as I mentioned, this high politicization of Chinese investments in Europe, it is very clear that it would have been way more difficult for the CAI to be ratified if national parliaments and subnational parliaments would have been involved. It will be way easier for the agreement to be ratified only with the input of the Council of the EU and the European Parliament. So in that sense, you could argue, and I would argue, that the very absence of ISDS is good from the perspective of the prospects of ratification, not because of ISDS per se, but because of the impact of ISDS on the nature of the competence of the EU, or the division of labor between the EU and its member states. Does that answer your question? And for those of you who do not know anything about EU law, is that clear enough?
Thank you, Professor. But does that mean that the future ISDS mechanism under CAI will happen between EU members and China instead of EU and China?
It's a very, very good question. Yet another one. And to be honest, this is something I'm yet to understand. Namely, if the EU and China were to conclude an agreement, were to find a consensus on a substantive dispute settlement mechanism in the form of ICS, in the form of ISDS, how would it work? Would national parliaments only have to vote on those provisions, or would a new agreement have to be discussed by national parliaments and subnational parliaments? I mean, these are questions of EU law which I cannot answer. And I think there is no definite answer in that regard, to be honest, at this stage. Because that's a problem. I mean, when you, as a national parliament, get the possibility to give your opinion on a deal, you do not stick, obviously, to the question of ISDS. You want to talk about everything. You want to talk about labor rights. You want to talk about environmental protection. You want to talk about market access. So will national parliaments and subnational parliaments want to play the game and just discuss ISDS related provisions? That I'm really not sure, to be honest. Is that okay? Shall I move on?
If I may interrupt.
Yes, please.
Hello, Matthew. Thank you very much for your lecture. It's very interesting. I also have a question about the dispute resolution system under the CAI. The first one is about the possibility of compromise of the different alternatives from EU and China. As you mentioned, one of the points that is very difficult for both parties to reach an agreement on is China would like to have a system that let the disputing parties to have the autonomy to appoint arbitrators at the first level, while EU would like to have an investment court system. I'm thinking that it would be possible for China to accept mechanism that dispute on the one hand a disputing part a mechanism that disputing parties have the autonomy to appoint arbitrators from a pre-existing list of arbitrators, which are appointed by the treaty parties. I would like to ask your opinions about the possibility for the EU to accept such alternative. So this is my first question. The second question is about what we are left with. So besides, as you mentioned that we are left with the base between EU member states and China, but at the same time, we also have SSDS system, a state-to-state dispute settlement system. I would like to ask your opinion about the future of the real use of this system. Will this be put into practice under the KAI in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions. They are all very relevant. I mean, to be very honest with you on your first question, and maybe that Professor Yang can help me there. I mean, my understanding is that this is the way in which, I mean, the ICS under the CETA would work. I mean, you would have indeed, I mean, full-time adjudicators being appointed. We are talking there about a list of adjudicators which are appointed in advance by the two parties, and it is indeed those full-time adjudicators which would then be, I mean, which would then be used not only at first instance level but also at the level of the appeal. So my understanding is, I'm not.
Yeah,
I'm
indeed.
not, yeah,
indeed, that's what proposed by the EU. But
yes.
under the EU's proposal, the disputing parties don't have the right to choose from the
exactly.
from the pre-existing list. But I think I'm thinking, why not let the disputing parties to choose for their own case from the pre-existing list? Would this be an acceptable option for the EU?
I think the problem with that is, I mean, from the EU perspective, is that there is very much this understanding of ICS being of a public nature, if you like. And when you think about, I mean, adjudication, for instance, as it would take place at national level, I mean, you do not get to pick and choose the judges who will adjudicate on your case, right? I mean, the judges who are part of the system are by definition considered as being independent, as being, I mean, as being competent to deal with that case. Hence, indeed, this absence of possibility to kind of pick and choose the adjudicators you want to work on one particular case. So the only, I to be honest, I don't know whether this is the reason or the only reason, but bearing in mind the kind of narrative behind the ICS, that might be one of the reasons why what you describe, I mean, could be creating difficulties from the perspective of the EU. So that is on your...
Yeah. Thank you.
That, yeah. So that is on your first question. And on the second question, yes, I mean, we are likely, I mean, to have, I mean, state-to-state disputes and discussions and negotiations to take place. I mean, at the end of the day, when we look at the actual practice of the EU and China in the area of trade and in the context of the WTO, it is very clear that both actors have made, I mean, an increasing use of the instruments, of the legal instruments at their disposal to address any kind of trade-related issues they have, again, at WTO level. So I would say that whatever mechanisms are included in the KAI are indeed likely, I mean, to be used. That being said, and I would like now to say a few words on the existence or on the creation of those expert panels on those external panels on the falling under section 4 of the CAI, because there, I mean, we might have some indications on the likelihood for such panels to be established in view of the actual practice of the EU in application of other agreements, and in particular the EU-Korea agreement. So I will come back to that in a moment. So if I may, I will just go back to what I was saying about this idea of recalibrating investment agreements. So I've been talking about the EU. As you know, I mean, on the Chinese side, I mean, it has become now more common practice indeed for more recent BITs adopted by China to have sustainability provisions in terms of environmental protection and so on and so forth. So there, I mean, let's say that, to be honest, it was not one of the main obstacles in the negotiation of the CAI. Most of the difficulties came from issues pertaining to labor rights, with indeed only a very limited number of BITs adopted by China, including labor rights provisions. So now we are kind of left with the questions of what we have, I mean, in the CAI in terms of non-investment related protection in this whole rebalancing exercise. I mean, as Professor Young mentioned it, we have a reference indeed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights included in the preamble of the agreement. On environmental protection, fight against climate change, there was, and we should really not underestimate, I mean, the impact of that commitment to effectively implement the Paris Agreement, including the commitment with regard to the NDCs, the so-called nationally determined contributions, included in Article 6 of Section 4, subsection 2. What I would like now is just to say a few words about what was, I think, what has been one of the most debated provisions included in the CAI. That is Article 4 of subsection 3 of Section 4 of the CAI, which includes a commitment by both parties to, I quote, effectively implement the ratified International Labour Organization conventions, and this idea that each party shall make continued and sustained efforts to pursue ratification of ILO conventions, in particular ILO conventions number 29 and number 105. These two conventions, oh, yeah? Okay. These two conventions were very important from the perspective of the EU. I mean, just as a kind reminder, Convention number 29 is about forced labor, the abolition of forced labor, and Convention 105 is about the Convention 105 is about the abolition of forced labor, and the Convention 29 is about forced labor itself. So there was, I mean, in the EU, this idea that the protection of labor rights and forced labor was still an important issue in China. And in that sense, that the Article 4 was lacking some teeth, and namely that it would be difficult for the EU to kind of monitor the actual progress that China was making in terms of its existing ILO labor rights, I mean, commitments, but also in terms of pursuing the ratification of those two ILO conventions, which China has yet to ratify. And here, I mean, for those of you who are interested in comparative law, I mean, it's quite interesting to see that a decision has just been made by an expert panel, which was set up in application of the EU-Korea FTA. So the EU and Korea did ratify back in 2011, a free trade agreement between the EU and Korea entered into force in 2011. And 10 years after that, we had an expert panel, which was requested by the EU, about what was perceived as being the lack of sufficient actions by Korea, indeed, to ratify some outstanding ILO conventions that Korea had indeed to ratify. And quite interestingly, the EU-Korea FTA, I mean, uses a very similar language to the language of the CAI, namely this idea of making continued and sustained efforts towards the ratification of those ILO conventions. And very interestingly, I mean, the panel of experts which was set up in application of the EU-Korea FTA concluded that in order to demonstrate that you have made continued and sustained efforts, that you need to take steps, that you need to be able to demonstrate to the other party that you've been taking actual steps towards the ratification. So what does it mean? I mean, what does it mean for the CAI? I mean, first of all, first lesson, and this is to go back to the last question, we had to wait 10 years after the entry into force of the EU-Korea FTA to have a first panel decision such as the one I'm talking about. So we are not likely to see any disputes of this kind in the short term in the context of the EU-China investment relationship in application of Section 4 of the CAI. Secondly, I mean, we are not obviously talking about, I mean, reports by expert panels which can be properly enforced. I mean, there is no sanction mechanism. That being said, I mean, it is quite interesting to see, and that was perceived as an important victory on the EU side, the very fact that the reports by those expert panels will have to be public, and also will possibly involve, I mean, civil society organizations, which was another important requirement, another important point in the negotiations according to the EU. So even if expert panels such as this one are not enforceable, I mean, it's quite interesting, I mean, to see that on a similar wording that an expert panel has kind of concluded that this kind of lofty language of making continued and sustained efforts should be translated into taking actual steps towards indeed the ratification of the agreement. If I may just say very few words, I mean, about unilateral measures, which I would define as being as a kind of challenge, if you like, to the very process of investment liberalization. I'm not saying that they are bad things. I think that they are there to exist. But what is quite interesting when you think about the CAI is the fact that whilst on the one side, we have had the conclusion in principle of the CAI, at the same time, we've seen that on both the Chinese, but I will here primarily talk about the EU side, the actual toolbox at the disposal of the European Union to regulate, I mean, not only inward, but also outward foreign direct investments from or to China has become increasingly comprehensive. First of all, I just would like to refer to the fact that the EU has created its own foreign investment screening mechanism back in 2009. There had been a big debate, I mean, in the EU about the opportunity to create such a mechanism for quite a number of years. The argument, and here I just quote the former Commissioner for Trade of the European Union, was saying that it was not a good idea, sorry, to have such an investment screening mechanism at the EU level for one basic reason, that is, we need the money. That was back in 2012. But indeed, back in 2019, such an investment screening mechanism was created. Just to make it clear, there is no veto power of the European Union. But we are here talking primarily about a kind of information sharing mechanism between EU member states, also as a way to kind of avoid a situation where a member state would say no to one particular investment because this investment would be seen as a challenge to its national security, and then the foreign investor the next day would simply go and knock at the door of another EU member state to invest in the same sector. It is very clear that when this regulation was adopted by the EU, that China was in the background. I mean, a big emphasis was put on virtual infrastructure and cybersecurity in the framework establishing this regulation on the foreign investment screening mechanism. And it is really to be situated against the background of heavy, hectic debate with regard to Huawei investments in the digital infrastructure of EU member states, and in particular, the 5G infrastructure. Another unilateral instrument which is likely to have an impact is this idea that the European Union should adopt in the coming weeks, or at the very least in the coming months, a legally binding instruments on corporate due diligence and corporate accountability, which is therefore all about what the obligations of foreign investors are when they operate within the EU, but also when they operate outside the European Union. So there is very much this idea of translating the UN guiding principles on business and human rights into a legally binding instrument at EU level. The way forward, and I'm aware of time, I mean, just to be honest, very open to Professor Yang. I really have no problem, I mean, going until the very end, even if we made no break. But I see here that we have 15 minutes left in view of the timing that Professor Yang indicated. So I will now try to conclude. But before I do that, just a few points on the way forward. On the EU side, there was, I should rather say, I mean, at the end of December, when the agreement was concluded in principle, this idea that the Council should not vote before 2022. So there was this idea of giving indeed some time, I mean, before the ratification by the Council of the EU with a qualified majority and by the European Parliament with a simple majority. As I mentioned it, we are talking here about an agreement falling under the exclusive competence of the EU. It is not a mixed agreement because it does not include an ISDS provision and does not cover portfolio investments. And in that sense, national parliaments and subnational parliaments will not be involved directly, at least in the process. On the Chinese side, I mean, there is, and to be honest, for me, this is a very open question, and I would be very happy to hear Professor Yang's views on that. Whether, I mean, China will push the ratification of the CAI the same way as it did it with the RCEP. We are all, I mean, I think very surprised by the fact that China indeed took very much the lead in terms of a speedy and straightforward ratification process of RCEP. Will China take the same route, I mean, for the CAI? Here, I mean, and to me, it is really an open question, but I've not seen a single official Chinese translation of the CAI. Does it testify to a lack of interest, or at least a lack of willingness to quickly ratify the CAI? That I don't know. I just would like to flag the fact that when you compare, for instance, the CAI with the EU-Vietnam, for instance, FTA, that there was very much a kind of working Vietnamese translation of the agreement, which was made public very early in the process, during the negotiations of the bilateral FTA between the EU and Vietnam. So whether we'll see a prompt ratification process in China or not remains very much of a question mark. But here, obviously, and I was really glad to see many questions in that regard raised by the students, and I will be very happy to go back to them during the Q&A. That is very much the fact that the tit-for-tat sanctions, or this tit-for-tat sanctions dynamic, which we have seen since indeed the EU imposed sanctions upon a number of Chinese officials from the Xinjiang province, which has indeed led to China retaliating by imposing sanctions upon a number of European individuals and European entities, and I should also say all institutions linked to them, definitely has a negative impact on the prospects for the ratification of the CAI. The fact is that from the EU perspective, I mean, a number of members of the European Parliament, so the same Parliament which will have to vote on the CAI, have been targeted by the Chinese sanctions. So just to name one of them, the head of the European Parliament delegation responsible for the relationship with the PRC is one of the individuals which has been targeted by the sanctions. And as a kind of effect, I mean, a number of parliamentary groups of the European Parliament have argued that there was no way for the European Parliament to vote for an agreement as long as a number of individual members of the same parliament were targeted by sanctions by the PRC. So leading indeed, for instance, the main members of the European Parliament dealing with China in the INTA committee, which is the International Trade Committee, which is the committee which will review, I mean, the CAI and its content, stated that at the moment and in view of the sanctions, that CAI is not on the table for now. That's what I want to say at this stage, but I will be very happy to go back to that very point in a moment during the Q&A. If I may just conclude, I think that there are 3 points which I would like to mention as a conclusion. The first one is that from the European perspective, the very nature of the partnership with China remains very much questioned. And in that sense, this very uncertain status of the relationship between the EU and China from the European perspective, and probably also from the Chinese perspective, has in that sense an impact on or creates some uncertainty in terms of the future of the CAI. Is China, and here I would like just to quote the different ways in which China has been described by the EU itself, is China a cooperation partner, a negotiation partner, an economic partner, or is it a systemic rival? Secondly, if we want to understand the future prospects for the CAI, I mean, we have to understand, we have to look at the elephant in the room, which is obviously the United States. And in that sense, the future of the US-China trade war will obviously have an impact on the future of the CAI. And last but not least, I think that the CAI, as it stands today, or as it has been negotiated, testifies very much to the uncertain future of global trade and investment law. And I here make reference to trade and to investment on purpose, in the sense that CAI is yet another example of the very porosity or the very strong links which now bind trade and investment governance. I mean, in the past, we had a number of trade agreements dealing with investment-related issues, such as CETA, such as ASEAN, and so on and so forth. But now what we see are the emergence of new generations of BITs, such as the CAI, which do deal indeed with a number of issues which we were all used to see indeed in trade agreements. That's for one, but indeed also the uncertain future of international investment law, not least in view of what is the future of dispute resolution mechanisms, that is to ISDS, not to ISDS, the future of ICS, or indeed the prospects and challenges towards the creation of a multilateral investment court. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and the floor is back to Professor Yang and all the others on the other side of the world.
Thank you so much. Time for you to have some water, right? So it's a non-stop 136 minutes lecture and Q&As on the CAI. I think all the audience, including myself, benefit a lot from this introduction and Q&A. So before I come back to your question on the Chinese ratification issue, let me just conclude by one comment. I think this will be a very important area, that even the CAI was not ratified, even the CAI could not come into effect. The commitments made in the CAI by Chinese side will be having very significant influence in China. The reason was that China made very significant important commitments for SOEs, or covered entities, and environment, labor. So China has made commitments, although it's not a commitment under the agreement yet, but that means, the commitment itself means that China can and will do all this kind of very sensitive and significant areas. So this is the one point I wanted to share with you and all the audience. This is also the almost only one comment from me. And for the Chinese ratification issue, it is really awkward that we only have an English version in front of us. I have in front of me with only one English one. We do not have a official translation of the Chinese version. But I came from Ministry of Commerce. My former colleagues were in charge of these negotiations. I guess that they already have the internal Chinese translations already, right? Ready, but not for publication. I guess the reason was that they only wanted to publish the ratified final version rather than the version we have in front of us right now, the English version. I know that EU, for the EU Commission, EU and the Commission, you have a so-called transparency policy. You need to publicize the draft, even the drafts, right? And firstly, the draft text, and then secondly, a few weeks later, the schedules, right? So all published. But here in China, I guess that they wanted to publish the Chinese version, official one, with the final version. So that's the difference. So which means that we cannot draw a conclusion analogy from this current situation of without Chinese version, that Chinese is not willing to do something. That's sure. Not my conclusion. Thank you very much. So with that, I said at the very beginning that we will conclude that Beijing time is 4:40, Brussels time is 9:40. We have concluded, but I would invite Professor Cui Guobing to give us the final remarks. Before that, I just wanted to thank you, Matthieu. I just hope that one day you could visit Tsinghua and come to my class. We will be having face-to-face discussions. Thank you. Good luck.
Okay. I realize that's a student raised a question in the chat board. He already finished the question? I don't know.
As I said, I'm very happy to go back to the question of the chat or even any of the questions which were submitted to me in writing before. So you're the timekeeper. So please just tell me how you would like to proceed.
国民，我的课呢，我们课已经下课了。如果觉得大家如果需要交流，可以再继续交流。但是呢，但是他是不是也很累了？他是不是也很累了？你要不要做一个总结？
Okay, Professor Yang just said the class for student was over, so now the students are free to go. But we still have, if we wish, still could exchange through this meeting room.
But let me then really thank you, thank Professor Yang and you, Professor Cui. I mean, again for the invitation. I mean, I truly enjoyed. I mean, the interactions with your students, the possibility to share my views with you on the CAI, and indeed, I very much hope that I very much share. I mean, Professor Yang's assessment of the CAI, whose value is there to stay, even if the agreement was not to be ratified. And I think that it is true for China, but I would also say that it is true. It is true for the European Union. Now, what I think is really needed now is for dialogue and for again bridges to be created as a way for this agreement, which is, I think, quite a good agreement from both perspectives, to be ratified. And in that sense, I would definitely, welcome more discussions, with colleagues at Tsinghua and hopefully in person. And it's amazing and so great to see that you can be in your class, Professor Yang, even without wearing a face mask with your students, something which is unfortunately still a dream on this side of the world, which is still badly hit by the pandemic. So hopefully we will follow, I mean, China's path in that regard, and we will be able to continue this discussion face to face in the coming months. But I really wanted to thank you again, and also to thank very much your students for the very, I mean, excellent questions which they had raised. I could not address all of them, so please, really, to the students, please don't hesitate to contact me via email if you would like to receive, I mean, an answer to any questions you may have regarding my presentation. It will be my pleasure to answer them.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you,
Okay.
Matthieu, for your wonderful lecture. Personally, I'm not an expert on this topic, but I find your lectures very clear and the content very interesting. And I guess the student will be finding the lecture very fruitful. Sure, we are looking forward to more cooperation, especially on the China project.
Thank you so much, Govin. And I wish you all a very good rest of the afternoon then. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. And
take care.
Yeah, okay. For over some school program, we still could wait, right?
We still have to wait indeed. I mean, I got the confirmation that we would get our project